so much, Zipo, and a very good morning and welcome to our esteemed panelists and our virtual attendees from across the globe to what promises to be a wonderful session on crypto, stablecoins and cash. And my sincere apologies for the communication glitch, which essentially meant that I spoke about my house to everyone. So please accept my sincere apologies for that. It nevertheless gives me great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Firstly, Dante Disparte, the Vice President and Head of Policy and Communications of the former Libra Association, now the Deem Association. And perhaps chief among Dante's numerous achievements is that it is now 3 o'clock in the morning where he lives in the US. So a massive and sincere thank you, Dante, for participating in today's session. Next, we have Farzam Ehsani, the co-founder and CEO of Valor, one of South Africa's largest crypto exchanges. And then we have Noelle, who is the Director of Research at CoinDesk and responsible for a wonderfully informative newsletter on all things crypto. Then last but certainly not least, we have Co-Pierre Georg, Associate Professor at the University of Cape Town. Co-Pierre is also the Chair of the South African Reserve Bank's Research in Financial Stability Studies and a part-time research economist at the Deutsche Bundesbank. So before we start, I would just like to share with our audience, in addition to what I already inadvertently shared, just share a discussion I had with Noelle in the run-up to this session, where we started talking about the challenges faced by the regulators in the fast-moving crypto environment. And I made the comment that during discussions with market participants, I often feel like the least knowledgeable person in the room, to which Noelle very nicely responded that if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. So I think based on that measure, I, for one, most certainly am in the right room today. And I think I speak on behalf of our audience in saying we greatly look forward to all our panelists' insights today. So let's dive right into it. Starting with crypto, Noelle, we cannot seem to get away from price despite some other much more interesting market developments. So I think let's get this out of the way first. Last week we saw Bitcoin breach its all-time high on some exchanges, but failing to breach the $20,000 mark. Broadly reflecting the historical positive but lagged price action observed in the months following the Bitcoin block reward halving. So reflecting on the 2017 crypto bull run and the subsequent crash early 2018, what do you think is or might be different in 2021 compared to 2017? And then also with regard to altcoins, most, if not all, have not yet staged a proportional recovery compared to Bitcoin. So how do you see some of the other crypto projects maturing in 2021 across the industry?
That's a great question, Herco, and thank you. It is fascinating to watch how different this particular bull run in Bitcoin is compared to 2017. Back in 2017, I remember with my colleagues just staring at our phones with our mouths open because it just did not make any sense. This one makes a lot more sense. Back in 2017, the run, it felt very retail focused, was fueled by hype. We had Bitcoin on the front page of the Daily Mail in the UK even. This time, it's very institution driven. We have had quite notable support come from renowned investors, and the CME, which is the regulated derivatives exchange, is showing spikes in volume that really show that the institutions are coming in. OTC desks confirm the same thing. So there's a lot more going on under the surface even than what we are hearing about. It feels more muted. It feels more substantial. We must also bear in mind that back in 2017, there wasn't a choice of institutional grade platforms for the institutions to transact through, and there wasn't a lively derivatives market. And there wasn't any talk of stable coins or CBDCs. I mean, there were stable coins back then, but they certainly didn't have anything like the volumes or provide anything like the liquidity that they're providing now. So the fact that it's Bitcoin that's running, to go back to your last question, the fact that it's Bitcoin that's running and not the altcoins, again, underlines that this is an institutional driven rally. And I think it's just started. We know that professional fund managers tend to move as a pack, and FOMO is starting to kick in among many, and especially since it's very hard these days to get yield anywhere else, and especially since the stock markets have been relentlessly rising in the face of pretty bad news, that's got to make a lot of fund managers uneasy. And the monetary policy environment that we're in is also focusing a lot of attention, not just on an asset that has nothing to do with the economy, such as Bitcoin and gold, but also an asset that harnesses the technology to perhaps solve some of the issues that finance has been trying to patch over since the last crisis and has been unsuccessful in doing so.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Noelle. Maybe just to focus in on one of the aspects you mentioned, and I think maybe continuing with crypto, Farzam. We've since 2017 been hearing institutional investors getting involved in crypto will be a game changer for the industry. And I think internationally, we've seen the likes of Square acquire around 5,000 Bitcoin, MicroStrategy continuing to add to its Bitcoin position of almost 17,000 Bitcoin currently, and UK FinTech Mode announcing that it will hold a percentage of its cash reserves in Bitcoin. So from Valor's perspective specifically, and in the South African context even more specifically, how do you firstly assess the institutional interest in crypto, and secondly, actual entry into crypto from an institutional perspective?
Yeah, sure. So since we're a cryptocurrency exchange in South Africa, and we support both retail investors as well as institutions, we can see who is signing up, obviously, as a corporate or as an institutional investor, and those that are retail. And we've seen a big tick up in institutional or corporate investors recently. They've always been there on the Valor platform. I mean, when I say always, we've been in operation for 2 years now. But we see consistently more corporates that are coming in. We've actually had a JSE listed company that has signed up as well to Valor. So we do see that they are coming in South Africa. However, I would say that in South Africa particularly, we're probably a little bit behind the curve from kind of the mindset of mandates changing for asset managers, etc. So speaking to many of them, when you ask why are they not getting into Bitcoin yet, the response is often that we need to change our mandate, and the people sitting on the boards to change the mandates are people in their 60s, 70s, 50s, whatever it is, quite like in a different generation to what we see the cryptocurrency space really appealing to. But I think, as we've seen in other parts of the world, that is already changing. And I think people of all ages are starting to understand the appeal of cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, particularly against the backdrop of what's happening in the traditional financial system. And also, you may have seen recently the German finance minister was quoted as saying that we must do everything possible to make sure the currency monopoly remains in the hands of states. And I think a lot of people are saying, well, we don't really necessarily trust that central bankers around the world fully appreciate and understand the nuances that are taking place with monetary policy, having gone from conventional monetary policy to unconventional monetary policy, and seeing interest rates at all-time lows from account lows that have been in 5,000 years. So we're in a precarious situation, and I think many people are starting to see the appeal of something scarce and digital like Bitcoin, and the institutions are starting very much to wake up to that.
Thanks very much, Farzam. You mentioned the educational component, and I think the increase in the general level of understanding around crypto, etc. And I would love to revisit this a little later in the panel. But for now, I'd like to maybe move to stablecoins and CBDC, or central bank digital currency, Co-Pierre. So I think the main criticisms against crypto historically have been the inherent volatility, which in particular have made them unsuitable as a payment instrument or a stable store of value. So stablecoins appear well positioned to address these challenges appropriately, with the growing popularity of stablecoins as a crypto trading pair likely bearing testimony to this. So I think 3 years ago, there was only one stablecoin in the top 100 coins measured by market cap. I think today there are around 7. So my question to you is, what do you think the longer term effects of stablecoins could be? Do you think this will assist crypto in truly going mainstream as a payment instrument? And how could the issuance of CBDC possibly impact traditional and emerging global stablecoins?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think aside from the volatility in crypto markets, the main concern by financial economists has always been the rampant price manipulation in these markets. And stablecoins are a perfect example, with Tether outright manipulating the price of Bitcoin, as sort of several papers have found. I think that has been a concern for a very long time, that sort of the stablecoins, in particular Tether, who has been out there, have not had the governance structure necessary to support sort of a broader ecosystem, but have acted in a very selfish interest. I think with new stablecoins that has changed, and there are sort of much more reputable players now in the market making an impact, sort of facilitating new use cases. The big question in my mind is, what role central banks are going to play. And I will disagree with Farzam on the issue of central banks not having sort of reacted properly to the crisis. I think it's easy to say in hindsight we should have done X, we should have done Y. I think with information at the time, I don't think there would have been institutions better suited with better decisions than what we have achieved as a central bank community. Whether this has sort of always had sort of only consequences that we anticipated or that we wanted, no doubt there were things that could have been done better, but hindsight is 20/20 on this. I think central banks need to come to the party and start providing infrastructure that can facilitate a financial system of the future. The big question in my mind is, between central banks and stablecoins, is what kind of infrastructure are we going to build? And if you want to do an analogy with a rail system, it's a question, if you have stablecoins, it's a question of whether you build the rail system like in the UK, where you have a bunch of competing sort of rail companies, or whether you want to build a rail system like Switzerland, where you have a national rail company that works well, that is on time, is a matter of national pride. And I think central banks would do well in sort of trying to aim for the latter and make sure that the former sort of doesn't play out in the same way that we've seen on the rail system. So we need to provide future infrastructure that can get all the innovation that we want, that can get market participants sort of on our rails. And historically, we haven't been doing badly on this. The traditional payment system is incredibly cheaper than any Bitcoin, Ethereum, whatever, orders of magnitude cheaper. The only difference comes from the access that central banks have granted to banks, where there is a sort of monopoly in the access to the payment system. I think this needs to be challenged. And whether it happens through private initiatives like stablecoins or private crypto assets, or public initiatives like CBDC, we can discuss that. But I think that is the change that we need in order to sort of improve the efficiency and competitiveness of the financial system.
Thanks very much, Co-Pierre. So you mentioned Tether, and I think you're kind of alluding to almost the first mover advantage. And I think being one of the older stablecoins, it's potentially positioned itself in the market. And I think there's some interesting alternatives arising. But I think in terms of the issue around first mover advantage, how important is it for CBDC to be issued, in your view, as a matter of priority for central banks? And if we look at something like Facebook's Deem, would it matter if Deem launches in the next few months and the various CBDC projects across the globe only come to fruition over the next few years? And in your view, would there be a first mover advantage to be had by Deem should it launch within the next few months?
Well, I think there's a first mover advantage already. You know, Libra, when it started, now Deem, they did capture a big part of the mind share of central bankers. They did capture it by fear mostly, but you know, that's fine. I think it was a wake-up call that was necessary and that was heard around the world. That there is a genuine use case for these kind of applications. I think central banks need to make sure that we are not left behind, but that indeed the monopoly over money and the control of money stays within the hand of central banks, not for ideological reasons, but for purely practical reasons, in ensuring that monetary policy is appropriate in the monetary policy area that is conducted, that we have proper trade-offs with financial stability. The mandate of central banks is quite different than any private participant. I think more than Libra just scaring us sort of like the central bank as boogeyman, I think the bigger driving force has been the increased understanding of the value of asset tokenization. And so of all the use cases that can come from it, both in the real economy where you have property tokenization, cattle tokenization, so where you open up alternative asset classes to investors that didn't have access to them before. So facilitating this requires you to solve the cash on ledger problem, and central banks do understand it. They do understand that we need a new kind of infrastructure to have that. When we move into the data economy, this will become turbocharged in the next couple of years. And I think DM will play a big role in facilitating this for retail investors and for some institutions. But at the end of the day, I think that central banks have heard the message very loud and clear. And I think it's like 80 or 90 central banks around the world working on CBDC projects. Helvetia has just launched. Now, there's news almost every week now from a central bank having another successful pilot. I think for institutions as old, central banks aren't faring so badly when it comes to waking up to this kind of new world.
Thanks very much, Co-Pierre. So Noelle, I think just before going to Dante, I'd like to hear your views, please, on how do you see global stablecoins and CBDC potentially interacting, complementing each other, or even competing with each other?
That's one of the things that I'm most interested about when it comes to CBDCs. It's not something that investors, which is what I tend to focus on, are going to be particularly interested in, except when you take into account that for CBDCs to be used by a population, they need to have digital wallets. We're seeing some very interesting trials on precisely this coming out of China with the DCEP trial that's happening, I think, this week, where there's a special shopping holiday, I think, this weekend in China, and one of their largest retailers is now going to be accepting this the government digital currency. This is the first time it's going to be that much in the hands of the retail users. People have these wallets, so they're going to have these wallets. Their government is asking them to have these wallets, and so they're going to be thinking, what else can we do with these wallets? Stablecoins are a fairly easy way to transact, as Co-Pierre mentioned, and once you have stablecoins, a whole lot of other use cases can come to light. People say that with CBDCs, you're not going to need private stablecoins, but we're losing sight of the fact that this technology allows for programmable money. We can have the CBDC, which is the transactional cash equivalent, but then there's all sorts of things that you can do with the concept of programmable money that will enhance its use in certain areas and give additional functionalities in others, and also touching on what Co-Pierre said when it comes to the tokenization of assets. I wouldn't be surprised to see assets being tokenized and that being used as a type of money.
Thanks, Noelle. Farzam, you are, I think, a self-professed one of the largest crypto bulls, both in South Africa and potentially globally. What are your views? How do you see kind of global stablecoins, crypto, CBDC potentially interacting, complementing each other, or even competing?
Yeah, I think it's important to go back to the basics of what we're talking about, because sometimes the acronym, it distracts from what we're actually talking about. So first of all, with central bank money, we already will, let's take all the money in the world. Already all the money in the world's, fiat currency, about 95% of it is digital. So when we talk about a central bank digital currency, a CBDC, what we're actually talking about is the fact that we want to enable digital currency for the retail customer, all right? Because commercial banks already have digital central bank money, gold reserve, sitting with the central bank. But the only way for an individual to hold government or central bank money right now is through a physical notes and coins. All right, that's the only way they have access to the central bank's balance sheet. So when we talk about CBDC, the digital is really talking about enabling a retail-focused digital currency, which is not available at this point right now. Now, it's also important to remember that we have physical notes and coins in terms of fiat currency. We have digital, which is what you have with your bank. And so if you did have CBDC, we're talking about a third form of the same currency. So just right now, just the way the $100 bill is equal to $100 on a banking app, a CBDC is going to be also $100 worth of that is equal to the digital, is equal to the physical. And so when you go to a restaurant and you want to settle something with $100, you have three choices. So, going back to kind of the issue with central bank money right now, we have to remember that we only have it's been 49 years since we've been off the gold standard when President Nixon took us off the gold standard. In that time, the dollar's lost 98% of its value against gold. So we're still in a very experimental phase of government central bank money that's unbacked from anything that's actually scarce, right? So I think given that context, when we talk about CBDCs, it's important to know that it doesn't change monetary policy. It's not a solution to any conventional monetary policy issues, etc. It's just another form. And so given that, right now, does the dollar compete with the South African rand or the Chinese renminbi? Yes, we're talking about the Chinese that are trying to have more dominance with the renminbi. the Americans still wanting the dollar to have reserve currency status. But I think what we're seeing is that money from a government perspective right now is based on the nation state. And the world is moving beyond the nation state, for better or for worse. And so I think that's where we'll see other types of money, cryptocurrencies, maybe it's Bitcoin, maybe it's not Bitcoin, but that are outside the control of traditional institutions that manage money. I think they will start to see a kind of an ascension, so to speak. And I think we're already seeing that. And so my view is that, is it good? Absolutely. Let's have it. There's no problem with that. But let's also remember that a stable coin is only stable whilst the underlying currency is stable. So if you have any currency crisis with the dollar or anything else like that, those stable coins will cease to be stable coins.
Those are some great points. Thanks very much, Farzam. And I think you raised some interesting, or you have some really interesting insights on moving beyond the nation state. And I think moving over to Dante and Deem specifically, I think the announcement of Libra originally, I think that was really kind of, I think Pierre mentioned it was like a wake-up call in many instances to many role players around the world. And I think something that's personally for me been very interesting. It's almost like it is. It's almost like a competition. Or it's not necessarily positioned as such, but you can potentially view it as being competition to central bank money and the like. And I think challenging this potentially challenging the nation state that Farzam mentioned. So I think moving to global stablecoins and Deem specifically, Dante, my questions to you are, what are some of the lingering misconceptions about Deem? And how did this influence the rebranding from Libra to Deem?
Yeah, thank you, Herco. And so indeed, I feel slightly disadvantaged because I've joined the smartest panel in the room with some of the smartest people on the subject in the entire world at the latest hour possible here in Washington, but nevertheless a pleasure. So I would argue a couple of key points at the outset. The first is that what we've heard throughout the last round of commentary is effectively the concept that the vast amount of money in circulation today, especially the money that flows through the banking system into the financial services sector, is in fact privately issued. But the second you start to add value to central bank money in any form, whether it's analog or digital, or in the case of cryptocurrencies, cryptographically coded on a blockchain, the second you start to add value to that money, the presupposition is that a private sector actor has started to engage with it, right? And think of that in the context of this pandemic, that even before this pandemic, billions of people around the world were left outside of the financial system. Billions more were on the margins of it, and then hundreds of millions more, those born who have won the postal code lottery or the birth code lottery, those born inside efficient payment systems, nonetheless have interoperability challenges that introduce death by 1,000 cuts whenever they want to pay from one provider to another. So in that environment, I would submit, and I think like some of the other panelists tonight, that we have a long way to go before we could argue that we've completed one of the core objectives that I think is important, which is that access to money and access to the bottom rung of financial services should begin with being a human right, and that from that principle up, if money is a public good and the digital rails that you could then transfer value with at scale and at population scale should be seen as digital commons, then this concept of a tension between the public sector and public sector oversight and private sector innovation, in my mind, is a bit of a false narrative. And I hope we've evidenced that over the last year and a half in the evolution of this project. The first example is a commitment to getting the network appropriately regulated. Imagine a world where the 1.7 billion people who have no access to a bank account, yet 1 billion of them have access to a low-cost internet-connected mobile phone. If that internet-connected mobile phone can become a compliant payment endpoint, then you overcome the fact that our financial system, which in so many ways riding on fixed infrastructure and brick and mortar banking, has reached its point of diminishing returns. This type of very basic precept extends the perimeter of payments without necessarily sacrificing safety. And so the concept that these types of projects are trying to compete with the sovereign sector, especially in a world where so much of this energy is really a hybrid approach. I think others on the panel would agree that if 80% of the world's central banks are thinking about CBDC, invariably the public-private opportunity to collaborate in this space is, in my mind, what we should see on the horizon in the next 5 years or so. So a lot of what we're building is about core infrastructure, digital commons, and most importantly, it's about financial inclusion. And for far too long, financial exclusion has been an Olympic sport, and so much of the world would get a gold medal. So we do have a chance to do something fundamentally different by pulling more people into the basic bottom rung of global payments.
Thanks, Dante. That's most insightful. And I think what I'm taking out from your comments is that it is not usurpation, it is the intention, or it's the objective to collaborate and to explore synergies. So maybe, Dante, if I can just follow on from that one. So I think coming back to crypto's original value proposition, so I think it was very much a separate, segregated system, not reliant on being interoperable with the existing financial and banking system, or not necessarily being interoperable and integrated. But I think I think there's been a slight change in perspective over the last 12 months or so, where there's potentially increasing appreciation for the benefits of exploring linkages and potential synergies in the interest of interoperability between the existing financial system and crypto and stablecoin related value propositions. So what are your views on maintaining segregation versus exploring synergies and interoperability, and what are the benefits and risks of each?
Yeah, so the question sort of reminds me at the outset of that great iconoclastic automotive executive from South Africa, Elon Musk, right? That combating and contesting the internal combustion engine doesn't kill mobility any more than having breakthroughs in renewable energy turns the lights off. And so I think what the advent of digital currencies and cryptocurrencies has produced, and hopefully there's enough of an aha moment in the corridors of power and in the regulatory corridors around the world to realize that this innovation is not about revolution, it's about evolution. And that if we get it right, it increases optionality for people's payments. I think it was just mentioned a moment ago that a dollar is a dollar is a dollar. In whichever form it is produced, its inherent intrinsic value and its value proposition is partly enshrined in the fact that you have an independent central bank that underpins it, but that you also have optionalities for how it is transferred and how it is conveyed. And so here in the United States, as the US federal government was responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, the first wave of stimulus money, $5.5 trillion of public taxpayer money, effectively to prop up the country, we had a call out in that provision for a digital dollar and a digital wallet to help introduce faster payments to people. In the absence of that infrastructure, think of the vulnerability. Analog checks, physical checks, check cashing locations, payday lending locations. So effectively, you're exacting the highest fees on the people who could pay for it the least or afford it the least. So, in that vein, these systems, crypto going mainstream and gaining more regulatory certainty, we certainly in this sector can produce exponential gains in financial compliance and risk management. I think it's just about completing the system, not competing with it.
Thanks very much, Dante. Co-Pierre, I can intuitively feel you would like to comment.
Yeah,
I'd like to go ahead.
So there's a few things I think that we should shed some light on. And the biggest when it comes to stablecoins is, where does the money go? If I know that sort of EM or Libra, they have this idea of high velocity kind of services. Still, when you look at companies like M-Pesa or pretty much any payment crypto, they basically float. That's a big chunk of their business model. There is residual funding that is not being used, and that needs to go somewhere. So as Farzam said, if you want to be a stable coin, you want to be perfectly safe, you need to find a safe way to put this. There is exactly one place where you can put this, and this is central bank reserves. There's no German bonds. There's no asset class that would be perfectly safe. And central banks' reserves are only safe in the sense of, legally central banks not being able to default. So that technically absorbs all the residual risk that you might run. At the moment, I know that there are discussions around providing access to central bank facilities. And to be honest, it's not something completely new. Actually, Bundesbank did offer accounts for everybody until around 2000, where you could have a normal account with Bundesbank as a private citizen, and you could have your bank account with them. The only reason sort of Bundesbank closed it because the customer service was so bad that it posed a reputational risk to the central bank. So then they just shut it down. So that tells you sort of a lot about sort of how careful central banks need to navigate it. But if you don't put it in central bank reserves, you start acquiring claims on the banking sector just mechanically because deposits will flow to you, which gives you a large bargaining power against the banks. You could go to, even if it's just a couple $100 million, you can go to the banks and say, we have these couple $100 million in deposits. We would like to have them tomorrow, please, which forces banks into liquidating assets so that the DM Libra Association could come in, buy these assets at fire sale prices. This creates a financial stability risk. So unless we find a way to actually put the money in a place where it's perfectly liquid, perfectly safe, there's, in my mind, mechanically that issue of creating financial stability risks that we need to address carefully, right? And I think nobody is saying that it's a bad idea, but we need to make sure that the funding flows can be managed in a way that doesn't endanger financial stability risk. And then maybe just one small point on the CBDC as programmable money. Most CBDC projects I know will have CBDC as programmable money simply because it makes perfect sense to have a commitment device. There's sort of issues of commitment in financial contracting that you can solve through smart contracts or through a central bank run digital currency that gives you the same kind of functionality. There's no sort of automatism to have this private sector issue. The central banks could do that, and we could do it with our existing payment system if we wanted to. It's really a question about who gets access. And at the moment, it's only the banks because they are specially regulated through bank charters. And part of the discussion, to bring it full circle to Dante, is around the stablecoin discussion is that some US Democrats have now suggested that that stablecoins actually should get bank charters in the US. And in my mind, that makes a lot of sense because in order to get them perfectly safe, we do need to think about giving stablecoins some of the privileges that only banks enjoy at the moment. But with these privileges, there does come additional regulatory burden, I think. And it's not an unfair bargain. So I'd be interested to hear sort of your thoughts on that proposal. Just put you on the spot a little bit.
Yeah, well, I would equally like to hear that. So I think I can also equally feel Dante wanting to come in on the Libra reserve and the ongoing refinements to how it will be managed in a safe way. But I think maybe if we can park that one for now. But I think what would be really useful is to kind of to Co-Pierre's question, Dante, is your views on the proposals around requiring stablecoin issuers to adhere to or to require a banking license or to adhere to those requirements. And I think that's quite a recent development. So your insights on that would be much appreciated.
Yeah. So look, I mean, with a long enough view of history, we have to remember 2008. The last time we offset trillions of dollars of taxpayer money to effectively privatize gain and socialize losses, it was in 2008, courtesy in no small measure to the perils of fractional banking. A stable coin managed in the way we're designing this stable coin that is going through the rigors of a regulatory college, including 20 different institutions in the Swiss, under the watchful eye of the Swiss financial markets regulator, FINMA, in a process of starting a project, not even launching it yet, starting it, that has gone through the rigors of the Financial Stability Board and has taken into account and into the design of the project all of the recommendations coming from the FSB, in addition to FATF guidance on financial integrity and anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism, so on, is a stable coin with no precedent, right, in terms of the stability mechanism applying Basel III frameworks to this instrument. And this is an instrument that by design would have no fractionalization, that by design is being structured with the right types of protections, and is designed effectively as a payment instrument that's digitally native, that doesn't take bank holidays, and that enables people to pay each other as simply and as freely as they might send a message or have a video call. No instrument like that currently exists, and none of it exists on an operating system that is open and that promotes competition. And all of it, I might add, is being done in the line of sight of the regulator. We're asking for permission, not forgiveness, which is a very distinct pathway for these types of efforts. And I would just say, to corner this into the existing banking system would only create a digital twin of a system that has fallen short and has failed billions of people around the world. So, you do have to leverage exponential technology in completely different ways. And that's part of where the regulatory conversation has to continue evolving.
Those are some great insights. Thanks, Dante. So I think you mentioned an interesting point around it being so novel, and there's no precedent for this. So I think I'm kind of looking to Noelle and Farzam. So I think in my view, if I kind of look at the topics that we're discussing today, so kind of cash, CBDC, crypto, global stablecoins, I think if we kind of look 10 years ahead, in my view, I think it's likely that all four of them will exist in 10 years' time. So I think that prompts an interesting question around what will the payments continuum or the market share of payment instruments and kind of money more broadly look like in 10 years' time. So I'd love to hear your views on that, please, Noelle, and then I think also yours after that, please, Farzam.
I love that question, Herco, because thinking about what money looks like in 10 years is a fascinating exercise, probably futile, because whatever we imagine it'll end up being something totally different. I mean, 10 years ago, did we ever imagine we'd be sitting here talking about central bank currencies on a crypto-driven blockchain? Probably not. So what do I think it'll look like? I do think we'll have the digital wallets that are given to us by our central banks. I do think that we'll have the digital identity part of that will be much more sophisticated and much more autonomous, much more sovereign, as it were. And because of that, we're going to have so many other digital applications built on top of these rails that the central banks are developing to enable payments to flow more smoothly. We'll have different types of money. I mean, one thing that Bitcoin has done for anyone who, I used to work in finance and I thought I understood money. Bitcoin taught me that I didn't understand money, and I'm pretty sure that most of my former colleagues still don't understand it. We'll have a different understanding of what money is. There'll be different types of payment assets, as we've talked about here, and there'll be different types of payments. I mean, we'll be making payments for things that we actually don't make payments for now because it's just not possible to do so. Whether all of this is the world that we want, I mean, that very much remains to be seen. What happens between now and then in the terms of the economy and politics, we all know that things are getting kind of weird out there, and next year is going to be very interesting. But what is fascinating is that we can have these kind of discussions amongst people that are coming at it from different points of view that don't necessarily even agree with each other, but are in agreement that the technology that has been unleashed on the world with the Bitcoin white paper in 2008 is not going away and is giving us a tool to rethink how fundamental pillars of our society work.
Thanks so much, Noelle. Farzam, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, a few things. So first of all, physical cash. Physical cash is not going anywhere. And it's a very simple reason why it's not going anywhere. It is because with physical cash, you don't need to own a device to receive remuneration of any sort. If you think about the poorest and most vulnerable in our society, homeless people, etc., who may not have a cell phone, it's untenable as a society for us not to give them the ability to accept cash without a device that costs money, right? So not until we solved abject poverty as humanity will we be able to get rid of physical cash. That's the first thing, all right? The second thing is when we think about this debate raging about monopolies of governments on money. I think you go back only 20, 30 years and there was a monopoly on information transfer by governments, which was through their postal systems. And then this internet came about and people tried to regulate it, and there was a lot of discussion, and we realized actually you can't. And so there was a competition for that centrally managed information rails via the internet, and we've come to terms with that, and in fact the world is better off because of it. So I think in the next 10 years what we will see is that there will be an efflorescence of activity outside of centrally governed nation states that will be overseeing what we call money society. That trend has begun, and it will continue without any doubt. And lastly, one of the main reasons for this second point that I've just made is I logged onto my banking app or my banking profile a couple of nights ago. I needed to make a payment and for like a tax payment. and it said, oh, sorry, it's past 8 p.m., you've missed the cutoff, log back in tomorrow. And I thought, this is insane, right? But I'm coming onto a digital platform without any human intervention, and there's a cutoff that I cannot actually process. And I literally had to go wait and log on the next day to submit the digital payment, which is ridiculous. So I think this last point is, today we have a concept of a cross-border payment. And we're comfortable with that. We have an industry with remittances and cross-border payment. And that concept will become as inane and silly as a concept of a cross-border email. And so long as the current financial institutions don't wake up to that, don't enable that, there will be other private institutions and decentralized institutions that will come and fill that gap, because it's just silly that in today's day and age, we cannot transact digitally at any time of the moment, of the day, of the week, of the year, regardless of if it's a holiday or not. So that will certainly change. Frictions will come down, costs will come down, and the world will become much smaller from a financial perspective.
Thanks very much, Farzam. I'm aware that we've got about 3 minutes left, so I would have loved to take a few questions from the audience, but I'm going to be selfish and maybe pose one last question to Dante, and then maybe a kind of a final reflections from Noelle and Co-Pierre. So I think, Dante, in my view, if we kind of look at crypto, Bitcoin, the mining of the Genesis block, subsequent issuance of altcoins, the subsequent issuance of stablecoins, and kind of now with Deem, which is, even though it hasn't launched, it's kind of been labeled as the first of potentially several or more than one at least global stablecoins. What do you think might be next? And this is maybe a slightly tricky question. So what's after Deem? So what do you think can we expect in kind of the payments landscape over the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the point that was brought up about digital identity is a massively important unmet issue. I think beyond that, if you think about all of the areas of the global economy where we have stranded assets, we have no hope as a planet of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals unless there's fundamental broad change that's much more inclusive. And so if you think about all the areas where we have stranded assets that could potentially be monetized because they can be tokenized and because people have trust at scale in technology, the same sort of dynamic that was just described about the internet doesn't yet exist for the transfer of value. The second you can crack that code, I think you open up a whole realm of pulling more people and more assets into the value stream. And with that, hopefully you lift more people out of abject poverty. We have a long way to go, but there's a lot of opportunity.
Excellent. Thanks for keeping that brief, Dante. So my final question is, with about 2 minutes to go, so maybe please, Noelle, 1 minute, Co-Pierre, 1 minute. I think in closing, and being from a central bank, it would probably be remiss of me not to leverage this forum for the regulators' benefit. So my closing question is kind of looking 5 to 10 years ahead. What would your one request and your one piece of advice to the regulators be? Noelle, please, and then Co-Pierre.
Continue to do their research. I do think that they're working very hard trying to understand not just the technology, but the potential implications. And again, not just the implications on banking, not just the implications on capital markets, but also the implications on assets, on poverty, on social movement. And it's incredibly important, especially these days with so much inequality, worsening inequality, which is causing political ructions around the world. It's fundamental that easier access to capital markets, easier access to the movement of funds becomes a fundamental right. It's necessary to not only lift people out of poverty, as Dante said, but also to save capitalism, really, if you just look around what's happening. And so regulators, get involved, keep working on this, talk to your constituents. There's a lot at stake.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Noelle. Co-Pierre?
90% of the world's data has been created in the past 2 years. What is more surprising, this statement has been true for roughly the past 30 years. What this means is it will probably stay true for the next 5 to 10 years. What this means is that there will be a gigantic data economy that is being developed at the moment. Most of the value in that data economy is currently being captured by central data processors like Facebook, Google, Amazon. I think this is about to change, where we see the emergence of data marketplaces, decentralized data marketplaces with true digital property rights and ownership of individuals over their data. In order to facilitate this development, to unlock all the value that is sitting there waiting for us to discover it, what we need is central banks to step up and provide a financial infrastructure that can actually facilitate this kind of new economy. In order to do that, I think it needs a partnership between the public and the private sector where one is not afraid of the other and one listens to the other. The IFWG in South Africa has been doing this for a couple of years very successfully, I think. And the open challenges in CBDC can be solved through such a partnership around privacy, around financial inclusion. And there are, just to sort of respond to Farzam real quick, there are solutions for to have digital payments for people without phones based on QR codes and data wallets. So we are making progress on this so that there is hope to actually reach literally everybody in the society, even with digital payment means, around interoperability and scalability. I think these are the 4 big topics that we need to address, with privacy being the by far the biggest one that is open. But research is making progress on these things. And so if that dialogue that we have today and that we have through the IFWG continues, I think we'll see great things happen. And it's just a lot of fun to be along for the ride.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Co-Pierre. We've unfortunately run out of time. I won't do a deep kind of wrap up, but I would, however, just in terms of getting back to the focus of the session, kind of, is it synergy or competition? Obviously, I think too many complexities and nuances to definitively answer that, but maybe just to quote something, I know Arif, our head of FinTech, is very fond of saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So on that bombshell, to our panelists, thank you ever so much for participating so actively. It was a wonderful conversation. It is much appreciated. Do have a wonderful day further. And with that, back to the studio. Thanks.